Anybody that knows me knows that I love anything thrifted, anything vintage with a little bit of history and fashion. So I thought this would be quite a cool video concept to combine those two elements together so that we are able to explore the fashion of that decade and also how people sewed through the years. One of my favorite pastimes at the thrift store is going through any vintage sewing patterns. We all know that fashion recycles itself, so a lot of the styles from 70 years ago are still relevant today. So let's go through my vintage sewing pattern collection and find the oldest sewing pattern that I have. So this is my thrifted pattern collection. This box and this box. As you can see, it's a little bit of an addiction. And I managed to go through these two boxes and I found some really cool or very old sewing patterns. So let me show you what those are. Now this first sewing pattern that I'm going to show you is a sewing pattern that is very old, and I'm not going to be sewing this one just yet because it's a full-on ball gown and I need a little bit more experience and a little bit more time to do this justice. It is a sewing pattern from the 1950s. So just keep in mind that World War II ended in 1945. So this sewing pattern was published only 5 years after World War II, which is insane to me. That makes this sewing pattern roughly 75 years old. Just imagine the places and the people that have used this pattern. It's just so insane to me how old this is. So I will circle back to this one and I will eventually sew it, just not quite yet. My next oldest sewing pattern was from the decade of the 1960s. So we've got quite a few varieties of 1960s patterns, and it's quite cool because you can see the evolution of how the style changed throughout 10 years. So these sewing patterns depict those changes. And some of these styles, most of these styles actually, are still very relevant and could be worn today. Let's have a look at the fashion history of the 1960s. The 1960s were referred to the swinging 60s, when the fashion movement was primarily focused on the idea of youthfulness, of childlike qualities. The main fashion garment of the 60s for the woman was the miniskirt. Hemlines rose just above the knee in 1961, but by 1966, the miniskirt was in full swing, with the hemlines being very risque. The style women were trying to attain was a skinny, pre-pubescent physique, with the epitome of youth, the schoolgirl model. Although the sexual revolution was taking place in the 60s, where women started coming out with more revealing styles, embracing their sexuality, there was a lot of emphasis on childlike qualities. So we saw this reflected in the fashion, with baby doll dresses, puff sleeves, pinafores, and miniskirts. Another huge movement that happened in the 1960s was the space age, the futuristic movement in fashion, where we saw a lot of PVC, a lot of wet look kind of materials, and a lot of outrageous styles and colors for this time. We are still very much seeing a lot of PVC and those wet look garments today, and that's directly influenced from 1960s styles. Women wore their hair long and straight, or by contrast had a very sharp and wedged bob. The makeup of the 1960s was a very blank canvas with the face, light foundation with light lips, and the main attraction was the eyes, where they wore very bold, bright colors on their eyes and very dark eyeliner. Men's fashion broke away from the gentleman's attire post-war and branched into more informal, more flamboyant, colorful fashion, where men were able to express themselves through fashion. Men's fashion was more conservative than women's in the 1960s. However, they were starting to kind of break out of that traditional menswear ideal. High-waisted trousers were replaced by low-waist trousers. High-collared shirts were worn with kipper ties. Jeans remained popular and were reserved not only for working wear, but also casual wear. We saw jeans being used to create shirts, jackets, and hats. During the 1960s, post-war, army and naval surplus stores were a huge trend. So all the military wear that didn't get used during the war got put into a shop for a very low price. Now, due to the economy at the time where people didn't have that much money to go and buy expensive textiles and expensive clothes, this was very accessible to the average consumer. Therefore, men and women would go into these Navy surplus stores and purchase a very military style wardrobe. Usually influenced the men's fashion, taking a very militant look in the 1960s. By the mid-1960s, gender norms started breaking down and women and men were able to shop in the same boutiques for jeans, sweatshirts, shirts, for very basic fashion staples. Women were allowed to wear those traditional smoking jackets, which were generally reserved only for men. And women were seen wearing suits and dressing more formal and smart. I'm going to be sewing one of these vintage 1960s patterns, and I want to see how much a sewing pattern has changed and how easy it is to sew as a home sewer. Not only am I going to be sewing from a 1960s sewing pattern, I am going to be using thrifted materials. It is no secret that home sewing has become a bit more expensive because of the cost of textiles and the materials that are needed. So I thought, what cool way to use a 5 rand pattern and thrifted cheap materials to make a whole garment that I will get wear out of. At the end of this project, I will tally up exactly how much it cost me and how much time it took me to create this garment. That way we can kind of have an idea of if it's worth it, if it's worth buying thrifted materials, if it's worth buying thrifted patterns, and if this dress could fit in fashion today. So when I had a little look at my pattern that I'm choosing, I'm going to make this dress here, and it's got quite cute pin tucks. Haven't really tried that before, but I thought it would be cool to try something out my comfort zone, try something new. So I've had a little look at the type of fabric that is needed, and it says cottons and blends, embroidered sheer cottons, linen, silk, synthetic and blends. And when I have a look at the dress here, you can see that it's got a little bit of like flow to it. You don't want to choose a fabric that's a bit too stiff, but also you don't want to choose a fabric that's going to not press properly because of those pin tucks over there. So I had a little look at my thrifted fabric collection, and I found this. So this is like it's like a cotton blend, and it's got a cute floral pattern, purple and green and white. And yeah, it's got a little bit of drape, so it will be quite flowy, but I know that's going to be able to press nicely to give me some sharp pin tucks. This is 2.5 meters, so it's exactly how much I needed. Hopefully I don't make any mistakes, so I won't have to recut anything. They have got buttons on the front here. They are optional. They're not functional buttons. They're just decorative buttons. So I may put them on. I may not put them on. I have a massive box of thrifted buttons. So I may just go through there and put them on if I find that it needs a little bit of something in the front. But the pattern is pretty much set out like a normal pattern that you would find now. Actually, let me grab one so I can compare it and show you. 2019, 1969. Same brand. That make patterns, simplicity. Okay, so if we have a look at the back, this is what the back looks like of the 2019 sewing pattern, and this is what the back looks like of the 1969 pattern. So fairly similar. It gives the same type of information: fabric needed, body measurements, finished garment measurements, pretty much the same thing. This one just has a pattern layout, whereas this one has just the garment types that you can sew, and that has that as well, just over here. So just slight differences, but still fairly similar. Obviously this is just in pieces and this one is not. But it's just really cool to see from the same brand how much it has evolved. It's going to be interesting to see how much the actual construction of the garment and the instructions, if there's any differences there too. Hey guys, Editing Hannah here. I'm busy finishing up the vlog, and I realized that when I was comparing the old simplicity pattern to the new one, I forgot to mention that the old one uses illustrations, whereas the new one uses live models. They use people, and I thought that was kind of cool, but I just completely forgot to mention it. So only thing left to do now is to sew. So I'll grab my materials and let's get sewing. So I've identified a mistake that I made. So as you can see, this side, the pleats are facing inward. And when I line up the two front bodice pieces, we do not have that. We have two of the same front bodice pieces here. So one of these has to get turned the other way, which is annoying, which means I have to unpick all of this and all of this, but that is sewing. I've finished the lining and I just wanted to play around with the pleats and see if I could, because they do have the option to have the pleats on the outside, but I do think I prefer the little pin tucks on the inside. I've just put it on the mannequin just to have a look at the shape, and I do really like it. So there'll be a zip at the back, but if we have a look at the back, we've also got some pin tucks on the waistline, and it just creates such a beautiful shape. So I've just finished doing all the pleats on the dress, and yeah, definitely came out a lot better than when I did my lining. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew the front panels together and the back panels to the front bodice pieces, and then I should be able to attach the lining. So let's go do that. And here we have the finished outer fabric. So it's not pinned on the form properly, but just so you can see all the pleats. So I've just sewn gathering stitches on the head of the sleeve. I'm going to gather those now to put into the dress. So when I read my instructions, I realized I needed to make the cuffs for the sleeves before I sew the sleeves in. So I've just made the cuffs. I've bagged them out and left this top side open. Now I need to put buttonholes over here. There's 3 buttonholes on the cuff, and then it kind of wraps around, and then you can button it in at the end. So it makes like a nice, neat little wrist cuff. I have trust issues with buttons, so I'm going to do a few attempts and we'll see how we go, but I need 6 buttonholes in total. Buttonholes done. Okay, this is where I'm gonna finish off. I need to go to work, but I've opened up the buttonholes, I've sewed on the buttons, and the cuffs are now done. Hey everybody, I just finished work. I'm back in the sewing room and I'm wanting to get this dress done now. I've been going through what I need to do still. I need to finish the sleeves. I need to gather them at the bottom into the cuff. I need to attach them to the dress. I need to put the lining together, do a zip at the back, and hem it. So a few things that I need to do, but I really want to get this dress done by tonight. So we'll see how that goes. Because I'm doing a lining and bagging it out, I don't have to do any neck facings or any back facings. So that's cool. So yeah, I just want to get it finished, and so I'm going to put on some sewing bee, and I am going to put you on a sewing montage. Let's go. Okay, let's turn this dress the right way around and see the magic. Hopefully everything is...
So we'll fill it up with some more snow hanging out on the sides. Christmas tree, some
There
characters.
we go.
This will be the full scene.
Nice. Yay! We've got a dress for the Lani attached. Woohoo! I'm going to be stopping for tonight because I'm getting a bit tired. But this is where we are up to. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully, this is going to be the final day. Hopefully this is going to be the final day. I've just got to put the other sleeve on, hem it, and we are done. I tried to push through last night, but I was just so tired I couldn't. Only managed to do one sleeve. We're keen to get this done today. Let's see how that goes. So yeah, another sewing montage. Here we go. And that is the final dress, everybody. I do have some final thoughts, so let's go into those now. Let's chat about if it's worth using a vintage sewing pattern. So I do have some thoughts on using a vintage sewing pattern, so let's go through those quickly. Old vintage sewing patterns may already be cut out on the size of the previous user. So when I opened this up, I realized it was only cut on a size 10, so therefore I had no other option but to use a size 10. If you are going into the shop, just check before you buy the pattern that it is either cut bigger size than yours or on your size. Another thing is that I was missing a back facing piece, so I did draft one just in case I needed it, but because I did a lining and I bagged it out, I didn't actually end up needing a back facing piece. But that is also something to note. Just double check before you buy the pattern that all the pattern pieces are still in the envelope. Older sewing patterns have measurements that you can refer to on the back, and it gives you the finished garments measurements and also the body, the bust, the waist and the hip measurements of the different sizes. When I took my measurements before I sewed the pattern together, I was in between a size 10 and a size 12. Now bodies have changed a lot since the 1960s. Bodies were a lot smaller back then. So usually I'm between a size 8 and a 10 today, but when I took my measurements I was between a 10 and a 12. I was going to try and do a 12, but then when I opened up the pattern and realized it was cut already on a size 10, I had to go with the size 10. Now the only difference with the size 10 and 12 was the waist measurements. The 10 is a little bit smaller, so it definitely cinches me in. It's giving House of CB vibes with those girls trying to zip up their dresses at the back. But it wasn't a huge issue with the bust and the hips, so luckily I was in between sizes and I could still make it work. Before you sew your vintage sewing patterns, just double check the measurements that you are and match it up to what they reference on the envelope at the back. Another thing to note is that when I was going through the instructions of the pattern, they were very vague, and you could see that they expected you to have some sort of knowledge of sewing before taking on this pattern. And I think it's because back in the day people did sewing in school and they did home economics, and people had a general understanding of sewing principles. So it's not, this one wasn't a beginner friendly pattern. You definitely did have to have some sort of understanding of sewing. But if I got into a situation where I didn't know what to do, I just YouTubed it and I was able to find resources for that. There were quite a few new things that I haven't done before, like pin tucks on the front. I hadn't done cuffs before. And if I was unsure, I just YouTubed it and it wasn't an issue. But just keep in mind that the instructions are quite vague and they don't have huge amounts of detail like sewing patterns today. Let's get into how much it cost me to make this dress and how long it took me to make this dress. It took me 2 hours to do the lining, and it took me 6 hours to make the actual dress and put it all together. Now keep in mind, I wasn't trying to sew fast, and I did make a few mistakes where I had to go back and unpick. So this was me sewing leisurely over a couple of days. If I had to sit down and really do it with time pressure, I probably could sew for less time, but I did enjoy sectioning up the project and doing it over a couple of days. The time it took me to complete this dress was 8 hours and 45 minutes. Let's get into how much it cost me to make this dress. I used thrifted materials to create this dress, and I think you're going to be mind blown by how much it cost me to actually put this together. The fabric cost me 20 Rand from the thrift store. The zip cost me 5 Rand. The buttons I already had, but I priced them at the thrift store and they're about 10 cents each. I needed 6 buttons in total, so that's 60 cents. The pattern cost me 5 Rand, and for full thread it cost me 1 Rand. Total cost for this dress was 31 Rand and 60 cents, which is insane. You can't buy a dress for that price at all. And the nice thing is that it's made to my measurements, it is lined, it's made better quality than fast fashion brands that will just fall apart at the first wash. Is the dress still able to fit in fashion today? I definitely do think so. It's got the beautiful puffy sleeves, which we are seeing a lot of, the cinched in waist giving like corset vibes, and I think it's really cute, and I had a lot of fun making it, and I definitely do think that it's worth buying a vintage pattern for 5 Rand and just making it work. If you are willing to put in the hours and enjoy the process of sewing, I definitely do think it is worth going to the thrift store, finding your materials, getting a vintage pattern, and making a dress that you are going to enjoy wearing, that you can tell people that you made the dress. Also, always know that feeling of when people ask where you got your garment from, and just have fun, play around with different fabrics, different patterns that you can find, and you can adjust patterns to suit you and get your measurements specifically, which is a luxury that you don't have when you buy fast fashion brands. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I had so much fun making it, and if you want me to look into other decades, the 70s, 80s, 90s, whatnot, I am very happy to dive into those decades, and we can kind of make this like a mini series. Leave your decades down below of what you want me to explore, and I will look into it. I have a lot of sewing patterns to reference, so we've got the references for sure. Please be sure to like this video, please subscribe for more content, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.